This is kind of like church. Everybody's in the back. The front pew is open, you know.
Want to start?
Okay, you bet.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to the Great Falls Association of Realtors. I'm Terry Thompson, the Executive Officer here at GFAR. A life of survival and gratitude. John Kunz was born in a Nazi concentration camp, arrived in USA as a refugee at age 6, and grew up in Great Falls. He graduated from Central Catholic High School in 1962. He enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps. Upon discharge as a sergeant, lived in New Jersey while studying at Rutgers University and supporting himself by tending bar. He returned to Great Falls in 1972. He spent many years in auto sales and management, and I think there was some story related to a love story regarding a car.
Yeah.
So if you know John Colleen, if you don't know that story, you can ask about that one later. In 1995, he switched careers to real estate. In 2000, John purchased Caldwell Banker Cogswell Real Estate from Ted
Cogswell.
And changed the name to Caldwell Banker The Falls. John sold the company in 2017. John and wife Colleen enjoy their vacation home at Big Fork and on Flathead Lake and travel. With that, please welcome John.
Thank you. And I'll start this with, in Polish, dzień dobry. Dzień dobry, that means good day. And this has a very special meaning to me every single day. What is the Holocaust? You know, they talk about the Holocaust, and the Holocaust was all about the Nazis against the Jews. Well, that's only part of the story. Unfortunately, our historians were negligent in how history is taught in the United States. Before 1986, American historians had written no American historians had written a systematic account of the Polish people under the German occupation. Prior to that time, the story of non-Jewish Poles had been subsumed by the Holocaust of the Jews. The writers on the Holocaust made no serious attempt to understand the magnitude of the tragedy that Christian Poles had experienced at the same time the Germans singled out the Jews as their primary, but clearly not their only victims. If Poles had been placed within that contextual framework, a more objective, balanced, and mature historical writing of the Holocaust of the Jews and the genocide of the Poles and other ethnic groups would have resulted. And that's from a book that I got, The Forgotten Holocaust. And that was written after 1986, of course. Of all the combatant countries, Poland was the one that lost by far the largest proportion of its people. Its losses in per capita terms were almost twice as high as those of the Soviet Union. What is more, the ratio of Jewish to non-Jewish deaths in Poland was virtually 1-to-1. For every Polish Jew who perished in the Holocaust, there was a Gentile Polish citizen who had perished in one or other of the many wartime horrors. And that's, that's something that needs to be shared and needs to be recognized, because I think, again, as the title of the book says, it was the Forgotten Holocaust. The Holocaust was Nazi Germany's vision, led by Adolf Hitler, to eliminate certain people that he felt were undesirable, mainly Jews, Poles, other Slavs, Gypsies, homosexuals, and then to populate the land with German colonists. So this is my story, the story of survival and gratitude. I've been very fortunate in my life, starting with being born in a Nazi concentration camp. That was the first fortunate thing that happened. Because if I hadn't been born there, I wouldn't be here with you. And this is a winter picture in 1946 of my mother holding me, and that was after the liberation of our camp by the U.S. Army. So I'm the cute kid in the middle there. Hitler issued a proclamation prior to his invasion of Poland. He invaded Poland September 1, 1939, but he had issued this proclamation in August 22nd of 1939, so prior to his invasion. And that proclamation says, "I have issued the command, and I'll have anybody who utters but one word of criticism executed by firing squad. That our war aim does not consist in reaching certain lines, but in the physical destruction of the enemy. Accordingly, I have placed my death head formations in readiness, for the present only in the east, with orders to them to send to death mercilessly and without compassion men, women, and children of Polish derivation and language. Only thus can we gain the living space, Lebensraum, that we need." So that was his proclamation to his troops in the east. And that was before he ever invaded Poland. So, in the beginning, my parents were both born in southeastern Poland. And my dad was born in 1906. This is going way back. I'm going to give you a whole bunch of history. And in 1906, my dad was born in southeastern Poland. And my mother was from that same area. They survived World War I. My father talked about hiding out in the forests as the Germans invaded World War I. So that was the beginning. And during that time, the area was populated, where my dad was from, the area was really populated by Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, some Russians, and ethnic Germans. And how that all happened was in Catherine the Great of Russia was really not Russian, she was German. So when she was in power in Russia in the 1700s, she invited German colonists to settle South Russia, which is the Ukraine. And so during that time, the German colonists all moved into South Russia, the Ukraine, and they colonized that area. They set up their own villages. They had their own schools, their own churches. They were not subject to the draft, and they were given a land grant. So it was similar to the Homestead Act in the United States, but this was in Russia during about that same time, as a matter of fact. And anyway, so this area where my dad was from was very homogenized. I mean, it was with a lot of different people living there, and they all got along. My father's family hid out in the forest during that war. My grandmother was wounded by shrapnel. We weren't sure whether it was the German army or the Russian army, because where they lived, they got attacked by both. She was wounded by shrapnel, lost an eye, wasn't able to speak. It lodged in her cheek, and but she survived. Then there was peace from 1919 to 1939, and that's when the Nazis invaded. World War II, the Germans invaded Poland from the east, and the Russians invaded from the Germans invaded from the west, the Russians invaded from the east. Oh, here's a picture of my German birth certificate issued right after the liberation by the U.S. Army. But that was issued in Bayreuth, Germany. So here's a map of Germany and Poland. Germany, the green; Poland, the purple. Kind of gives you a layout. Here we go. This is the map I wanted. Now, so this shows the German attacking from the west, and the Russians coming in from the east. And you see that little town Lvov, L-V-O-V? Right near there is where my parents were from. So they were caught kind of in a vice right between the two armies in both wars, World War I and World War II. This area was where some of the biggest battles between the Russian and German armies occurred, and also where later the Nazis had death or extermination camps. A well-known one was in the town of Belst. My parents talked of knowing its existence and the purpose and the overpowering smell of burning bodies. And currently, and this is kind of going full circle, my cousin's son, Tomas Haneko, is the director of a Holocaust museum at the town of Belst today. And Colleen and I met him last year when we were in Poland, and we were lucky enough to be able to have dinner with him in Krakow.
Is he Jewish, John?
No, that's, you know, I like that question, because any time that I tell somebody that I'm a survivor of the Holocaust, they ask me if I'm Jewish. Well, no, I'm not.
You weren't. I wanted to
No.
how he's honest.
No. So during World War II, the German Nazis operated several categories of Arbeitslager, labor camps, for different categories of inmates. Prisoners of Nazi labor camps were worked to death on short rations and in bad conditions, or killed if they became unable to work. Many died as a result of this forced labor under the Nazis. After the invasion of Poland in 1939, Jews and Poles over the age of 12 were subject to forced labor. In 1942, all non-Germans living in most of occupied Poland, that the Nazis called German general government, they were all subjected to forced labor. The use of forced labor in Nazi Germany in Nazi Germany and German-occupied Poland during World War II took place in an unprecedented scale. It also contributed to the mass extermination of populations in German-occupied Europe. The Nazi Germans abducted approximately 12 to 20 million people from almost 20 countries. About 2/3 came from Eastern Europe, primarily Poland. Many of the workers died as a result of their living conditions. Mistreatment, malnutrition, and torture were the main causes of death. In 1942, my family was removed from their farm by the German Nazis and watched the Germans slaughter their livestock and burn their farm. As the Germans were retreating from the Russians, and they didn't want to leave any spoils for the Russians to utilize. My parents and older siblings, along with thousands of other Poles, were shipped out of Poland to southern Germany by train in cattle cars to Nazi slave labor camps. My family was sent to a camp named Ramsenthal, and that was near the town of Bayreuth. And just to give you an overview, all those little red dots all over Germany and Poland, you know, people think of concentration camps, and they think of Auschwitz and Dachau and Majdanek, and, you know, that's only a handful. There were 800. There was 800 concentration camps through Germany and Poland during that time. And where we were was in southern Germany, and I think I can point that out to you. So we were near Dachau here. So it was way in southern Germany. And the main town there was Bayreuth, and I'll show you a map of that later. My father and my older brothers were sent out, and my brothers at this time were 12 and 13 years old. But my father and my brothers were sent out on work details as needed, sometimes as farm labor, sometimes construction, and even mining. My brothers were 12 and 13 in 1942. My mother also worked. She worked in a sewing factory for the Nazi cause. Food was limited to dry bread and at best a thin broth, turnips. For the rest of his life, my father hated broccoli and turnips. I was born in a barracks in that camp in 1944. Oh, this is the different styles of concentration camps that existed. Some of them were strictly killing sites and extermination. And some were slave labor camps. And then there was also prison camps. Okay. And again, this is just kind of shows the location of all the different concentration camps throughout Germany and Poland. Kind of shows you, again, back to the invasion. There's a picture of a concentration camp barracks at that time. So I was born in that camp. These wooden bunks, you can see the pictures of those wooden bunks. That's where I was born, was in one of those wooden bunks. There was no doctors. My older sister, Amelia, age 10, assisted at my birth, as she has later reminded me over the years. And she cared for me while my mother worked. Because of lack of sufficient food, my mother was not able to nurse me. They found another lady in the barracks that could, and we all survived. The war ended in 1945, and the camp was deserted by the Nazis as the U.S. Army advanced. That's a picture of me. Now I'm a little over a year old, standing on the chair, and that's my mother and my two sisters, one on each side. So this is my sister Stella and my sister Helen and my mother. I'm the cute kid.
One on the chair.
We were free, but we were set adrift with no means of survival, along with several million other prisoners of the Germans. From 1939 to 1945, the Nazis had abducted approximately 12 to 20 million people from all over Europe for slave labor and extermination. When it was liberated, my dad was not at the camp, but arrived shortly after. So we were able to stay together as a family. So out of that 12 to 20 million people, 21% were Polish. 6 million Poles were killed or died of starvation during this war. 1945, the U.S. Army and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Association, or Administration, along with the Red Cross, established refugee camps in order to assist and sort out millions of people from all over Europe left stranded in Germany. So all these people in Germany, they had no means of survival, they had no money, they had no papers, they had no identification, they had nothing, they had the clothes on their back. And so the U.S. Army was there to try to sort through these people and to help them find a way. We ended up in a refugee camp in Amberg, Germany, operated by the U.S. Army. We lived in that camp until 1949. And this camp, I do remember well. We all lived in one small room, but we had food and adequate clothing. Here's my two older brothers, and they were worked as adults. And this is in 1945, so now I think they're 14 and 15. And my oldest sister that assisted at my birth, right there. The only way that we could have gotten these photos was from a U.S. Army. And I'm sure they were documenting all of these camps as they were liberating them. And so just by luck and by somebody's goodwill that we were able to get these photos, and I'm sure they were taken by I'm sure a military man, you know. This is a picture of cousins of ours that were in that same camp at Ramsenthal. We lost track of them. Don't know where they ended up have had no contact with them whatsoever. This picture was taken also in 1945. This picture in 1946, this must have been kind of a transit camp, because now this isn't the camp at Ramsumtal anymore, but you can see just wooden huts, so I'm not sure what that location was. This is the refugee camp in Hamburg, Germany in 1948. It's a May Day celebration, and you see all the little Polish flags there, and May Day is kind of a national holiday in Poland, May 3rd. And I'm the obnoxious kid here in the front. Down here, that's me, and you can see the expression on that little girl's face. She wasn't very impressed with me, obviously.
I'm not hearing what you're saying.
Isn't that Colleen?
Yeah. She still looks that way. There's me and my father in 1948, right before we came back to the United States, when we came to the United States, rather. My two sisters and me, and these little outfits, these were traditional Polish costume that my mother sewed for the girls in Hamburg. There's Christmas in that cubicle where we lived in Hamburg, Germany. And we all lived in this one room, and you can see this is the width of the room, was about 8 feet. And it was just a row of cots along one wall, and that's where we lived. You know, so we lived there from 1945 to 1949. Part of this camp that we lived in was set aside for the gypsies, and this was my favorite part of the camp. They still had their horse-drawn wagons, and there was always good music and a campfire. So a great place for a kid. Another memory I have at this time where we were befriended by an American soldier who visited us regularly. And the only words in English that I knew when I came to the United States was the words to the song, "You Are My Sunshine." I had memorized the words to the chorus, "You Are My Sunshine," and I didn't know what it even meant. But I memorized the words phonetically. And so I was able to remember those, and when I came to the United States and the kids wanted to play and they wanted me to say something, "You are my sunshine, my," you know, okay, that's all I knew. You got to start someplace, right? At the end of the war, once we were documented, we were given the choice of either being shipped back to Poland or apply for a sponsorship to a choice of several countries, and those choices were the US, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Australia, and my dad, of course, wanted to come to the United States, and that was probably the longest waiting list, and that's why we spent almost 5 years in a refugee camp. My mother wanted to go back to Poland, family, you know, she wanted to go back. However, things had changed, you know, all of a sudden we were liberated from the Nazis, but guess what? The Yalta Agreement between Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill handed over all of Eastern Europe to the Soviets. So now Poland was communist. And my dad, and I had conversations with my dad about this, and he says, you know, my father said he had had enough of the Bolsheviks, the Nazis, and now the communists. He says, no, we're not going back to Poland. He says, we're going to wait and see how long it takes to get to the United States. And so we did. Oh, and then besides that, then the border also moved. So when the war ended, then the Polish border moved further west. So now, where my parents were both from was now Russia. And the first time that I went back to Poland in 1974, I took my mother there. She still had, her two sisters were still alive at that time in Poland. And we could from the edge of the border, there was a big tall fence, with the watchtowers and dividing Poland and Russia. And my mother could point out where our land was inside the border. That's, because that's where they were. I mean, that's where they were from. But anyway, my oldest brother Tom, he was now at the end of the war, and we were in Hamburg. He was now turned 18. He got tired of waiting for a sponsor to come to the United States, so he signed on to a labor recruiter from Great Britain and ended up going to England and worked in a coal mine just to get out of Germany. He says, I'm tired of sitting here and I'm tired of waiting, and so he wanted to get on with his life. So he left us in Germany and went to England and worked in a coal mine. Sponsors for relocation were solicited by different relief organizations such as UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, normally called UNRWA, Red Cross, and various church groups. Sponsors were responsible for the refugees' cost of transportation from Germany to the chosen destination country, and also assisting with finding a home and employment. Once they were settled and employed, the refugees were expected to reimburse the sponsor. At the end of 1949, we finally got a sponsor to the United States and came by ship to New York and processed at Ellis Island, and then boarded a train headed west. Destination unknown. We ended up in Butte. My mother got off the train in Butte and went into tears. Oh my God, she says, she thought we were going back to another concentration camp. Oh boy. We didn't know the language. We had no idea where the heck we were headed. I mean, we went through Ellis Island. They, give you all the vaccinations, the shots, all that, and load you on a train and see ya. So 4 or 5 days later, we end up in Butte. Luckily, there was a priest that came and met us at the train, and he could speak German, and my dad could speak German. So they could communicate, and this priest loaded us up in his car, and we headed to Fairfield, Montana. His parish was St. John the Evangelist in Fairfield, Montana. A little tiny parish, little tiny church. We and 20 other Polish families were sponsored by that church in Fairfield, Montana. Incredible. Incredible. The church is still there. They rebuilt it, but the original building is not there any longer. It was an old wooden church, and now it's a new brick church. They've redone that over the years. Father Russell Scheidler was the priest who adopted all of us. And those 20 Polish families came over a 2-year period from 1949 to 1951. Most of these families were scattered around central Montana, wherever they could find work. Some worked for Anaconda Smelter in Great Falls. Some worked for the Great Northern Railroad in Great Falls, Cut Bank, Shelby. Others worked on farms. And some of the families, and you might recognize some of the names, but I don't have the names of all of them, but this is just what I could, from my memory, could get. So some of the family names are Alekshinsky, Juzinski, Grabowski, Jędrzejewski, and Kryskowiaks. They were in Shelby. And Larry Kryskowiak was Bernard's son, and he became the head basketball coach at U of M and played pro ball for Utah Jazz, I believe. Then Kubis, Kunz, Mierzwinski, Olejnik, Pikars, Ryle, Shelchik, Świecinski, Voloshin, and Zazula. And Voloshins were here in Great Falls, Świecinskis also, Grabowskis. So our family lived in the basement of the church and the annex on the south side of the church for about a year. And the reason was because the priest had requested my mother to stay and become the camp cook for the rotation of refugees as they came through. So anyhow, so we ended up staying there almost a year before we finally got to Great Falls. Shortly after, but before we got to Great Falls, shortly after we got to Fairfield, I was rushed to Columbus Hospital in a coma. And I was in a coma from malnutrition caused by infection and parasites. And they didn't know, there wasn't any doctors in Fairfield at that time. I don't know if there is any doctor there at all. But anyway, I went into a coma. They didn't know what the heck, the problem was. They loaded me in a car. The priest loaded me in the car and drove to Great Falls to Columbus Hospital. So I spent, I think, a week or 10 days at the old Columbus Hospital on 2nd Avenue North, and they were able to determine what my problem was and to cure me. That was a scary thing, because when I came out of the coma, I didn't speak English. They didn't speak Polish. So I'm laying there, and where am I? And I couldn't talk to anybody. I was a scared little kid, but anyway. We moved to Great Falls. My dad worked as a carpenter and also spent 20 years as a custodian at Central Catholic High until he retired. My youngest sister, Anne Marie, was born in Great Falls in 1950. She was the first U.S. citizen in our family. Upon getting settled, my parents were able to get my brother Tom to join us in Montana. He went to work for Great Northern Railroad, but only there about 6 months, and got drafted and got sent to Korea in 1951. So it was very ironic. Here he just came out of one war and ended up back right into another war in Korea, 1951. We lived on the lower north side of Great Falls, near St. Anne's Cathedral, where I attended St. Mary's grade school. From the age of 8, I was selling the Evening News, the Great Falls Leader, on the corner of 1st Avenue South and 3rd Street, and was right across the street from the old Golden Gate Grocery, which is now Bert and Ernie's. At that time, at that time it was a very lively neighborhood. There was several bars on my corner of my territory. Several bars, a couple of cafes. I learned a lot of colorful English in there. And that was the beginning of my sales career. And all through high school, I worked at Durkin Oil Company, pumping gas and doing auto repair. And that was down on Machinery Row. I graduated from Central Catholic High in '62, then enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps. After my discharge as a sergeant, I moved to Newark, New Jersey. My 2 older brothers had settled. I worked part-time tending bar at my brother's Polish tavern. And this was a neighborhood, just the whole neighborhood where he had his tavern was all Polish. So at that time, during those years I was in New Jersey, I spoke Polish as much as I spoke English. It was about 50-50. During that time, I also worked for American Home Products, doing packaging research and development, and attended Rutgers University at night. I returned to Great Falls in '72 and worked in auto sales for many years, and then finally switched to real estate. Oh, in between all of that, then in 1983, I joined a group involved in planning the celebration of the centennial in Great Falls, and I was a member of the original authentic reenactment of the Lewis and Clark Portage around the Great Falls of the Missouri. I was Francois Labiche. I wasn't Polish. I had gone full circle, because where I ended up with my office, my real estate office, was exactly in the same location where I had worked all through high school. That was Durkin Oil Company, and and exactly that same footprint where I had worked all through high school, I ended up, that's where my office existed until I sold it. Both of my parents lived a long, full life in Great Falls after surviving the nightmare of World War II and the Nazi concentration camp. I'm the only one in the family left in Montana, In my heart, this will always be my home. The many friends and relationships that I have acquired over the years are priceless, and that's all of you. There's not a day that goes by that I'm not thankful for my life, my friends, and my opportunities in the United States. And I'm fortunate and grateful. Thank you.